Hi everyone. In this module, we are talking about global trade, but really maybe not in the way that you probably think of it. So when we talk about globalization now, we think about like supply chains, cheap goods, outsourcing, labor exploitation. But what I want you to see is that those patterns didn't just suddenly appear. In the modern world, many of them really took shape during this time period that we are going to talk about from about 1500 to 1750 or like 1450, go back up just a little bit to 1750, when the world became connected economically really for the first time. So this period created very enormous wealth for a lot of individuals and for countries, but it also created systems of exploitation, environmental damage, and human suffering, whose effects are really still with us and present today. So as you keep watching, I want you to keep one question kind of in your mind and in your head. Who benefited from all this global trade and who ends up paying the cost for it? So let's look at what we're going to be looking at in this module. So we're going to read over some of these key concepts and we're going to watch this little mini lecture. Then also you're going to read the chapter as you're doing your learning curve. Complete the check for understanding or the mini lecture quiz, and then complete all the assignments and achieve as well. So our learning objectives are right here for this chapter. We're going to explain how the first global economy emerged between 1450 and 1750, describe European expansion while recognizing the role of Asian, African, and indigenous societies, explain why China was the world's largest economy and how silver shaped global trade, assess the human and ecological consequences of early modern commerce, and compare different models of trading post-empires. So here's the timeline. Your book has this, and I love timelines. I'm a visual person. But you can see the European and Asian commerce, right? Start out with the Portuguese, the Dutch and the English, the Spanish and the Japanese. We're going to look at silver trade. Fur trade is very important during this time. It's often really overlooked. And then, of course, probably the greatest impact is the Atlantic slave trade. So our big question for this chapter, not for you to think about, but for the chapter, is how did global trade create immense wealth and immense human and environmental costs? Kind of the same thing, like who benefited from it and who suffered from it. So kind of looking at this from the beginning, one of the key concepts I want you to keep in mind is before 1450, people traded across regions. So we see a lot of trade across like Africa, Europe, and Asia, but those systems even themselves, they weren't fully connected yet. So what changed after 1450 was the scale of trade. So for the first time, we have the Americas linked to the Afro-Eurasian trade networks. Goods, people, plants, animals, and devastating diseases crossed oceans regularly, going back and forth between the two. And trade routes permanently connected the Eastern and the Western hemispheres. And this is why historians, we often describe this era as the birth of the first truly global economy. Now, one important correction to how the story is often told is Europeans became more visible in long-distance trade, but they were not dominant. They weren't the dominant economic power at the time. In fact, it's actually China was the largest and most productive economy in the world at this time. And global trade really revolved around access to those Asian markets. Christopher Columbus was looking for those Asian markets when he stumbled upon the Americas, right? So, those Europeans wanted access to those Asian goods, especially the spices, but they faced major obstacles. So those existing trade networks were controlled largely by Muslim merchants. They also relied on long-distance established Indian Ocean systems, and they favored Asian producers, not European ones. And so Europeans didn't have better goods, but what they had was naval power, right? They had like ships and navies now. So rather than conquering large territories at first, what European powers did is they built what historians call trading post empires. And in trading post empires, they're fortified ports at key trade locations. One of those, and we talk about this in my American history classes, one of those is called Elmina Castle. And this is on the West African coast. This castle was built, but really it's a slave trade fort Once Elmina Castle was built, the slave trade just exponentially takes off, right? Because now we have one location to collect slaves and put them on ships. So these key locations around like the coast of Africa and in India and on these islands, those are fortified by Europeans. They're designed to control choke points and also sea lanes, and they're enforced by cannons, by ships, and often by violence. Portugal pioneered this model because you have Henry the Navigator. He was the first one to like really scope out this land. We have the Portuguese that started like claiming territories along the African coastline and building these forts. And very quickly we have the Portuguese are followed by the Spanish, the Dutch, and the English. So what I want you to think about here is early European power came not from economic superiority, but from military force at sea. That economic power is still China. The military force is going to be on the high seas, and that's going to be European power. So if spices connected the world, then silver truly powered it. And in the mid-1500s, massive silver deposits are discovered in Spanish America, especially in present-day Bolivia. Potosi is kind of like the main point, the main location in Spanish America, and also in Japan. By this point, Spanish America had produced about 85% of the world's silver. So why does silver matter so much, you might be thinking? Because in the 1570s, the Chinese government consolidated its tax system and required taxes to be paid in silver. And I think that's under number 3 here. China's tax system required silver, drawing it from across the world. So, and as a result, silver flowed from the Americas. So here is, you can see like Spanish territory here, but also kind of the flow of silver. The directions of silver flow you can see by the arrows. And if you zoom in on this map, you can see it a little bit better. But silver flowed from the Americas to Europe, and then from Europe into Asia. Eventually, much of the world's silver is going to end up in China. And Europeans were often acting as middlemen, moving silver in exchange for Asian goods like silk and porcelain. So here's kind of the conundrum or the paradox. Silver made Spain incredibly wealthy, but it caused inflation. So it weakened the domestic industry, like within Spain itself, and ultimately it's going to contribute to Spain's decline. Meanwhile, in Asia, like Japan and China, use silver more strategically, strengthening their economies rather than undermining them. Global trade didn't just move metals and spices, it also reshaped the environment. And Europe's fur-bearing animals were largely depleted by 1500s, and then we have what's known as the Little Ice Age is going to happen. So the Little Ice Age happens right around the time of like discovery, and colder temperatures are going to develop during this Little Ice Age, and that's going to increase this demand for fur that we're going to get, especially from North America. So this sparked intense competition for furs in North America and also Siberia. And Europeans, they rarely hunted animals themselves. Instead, they're going to trade with the indigenous peoples. So especially here, like in North America, they're going to set up that fur trade network, especially like in modern day Canada. But these consequences are very severe. So they're overhunting, like pushed animals like beavers toward extinction. Indigenous societies became economically dependent on those European goods, and also disease, alcohol, and warfare are going to devastate these indigenous communities. And warfare because they're competing with other tribes, neighboring tribes, for the same fur, for the same like locations of where this fur is coming from. So trade also is going to reshape gender roles as well as enhancing men's hunting status while creating limited new economic opportunities for women. There's a really great show on Netflix. Jason Momoa is in it, and it's called Frontier, I believe. And if I have that wrong, look up. It's set in like Canada, and it's about like French trade and indigenous peoples, and also like there's some Irish that come into it. But it's a really great, I think it's like 3 seasons. It's a good example of what was happening with the fur trade though. So fur trade shows us like global demand can devastate local environments and societies even when participation is initially profitable. What about the people though, the commerce and people? So the most devastating part of early modern global trade is the transatlantic system, the slave system. So between the 1400s and the 1800s, about 12.5 million Africans are forcefully transported to the Americas. Millions more are going to die during capture, during transport, or what's known, like we call it, transport the Middle Passage, getting from like that middle area between Africa and the Americas. Slavery existed in a lot of societies right before this, but the Atlantic slave system is very distinct and just completely different than those other slave societies. It's racialized, it's hereditary, it's largely permanent, and it's central to plantation economies in the Caribbean, in South America, and in North America. And slave labor is going to power sugar production, silver mining, and agricultural export economies, excuse me. So I want you to look here. I have this bar graph for you and also a pie chart. So you can see slavery really taking off, especially like as we get more and more of the population in the Americas. So you'll notice more people start coming over in the 1700s and slaves are coming with them. Also, I think what's kind of taken out and sometimes misunderstood is where these people from Africa end up. We talk about American slavery a lot, right? Because we're in America, but we only have a small fraction of slaves. So think about all the slaves that were here in North America. That's nothing compared to what end up in the West Indies and the Caribbean and what ends up in like places like Brazil. So mainland North America, you can see here this pie chart, only about 3.6%. Spanish America, about 4.6%, but look at Brazil and the Caribbean. That's where most of that slave labor ends up. And they don't end up being taken from the Caribbean to the United States, what will be the U.S. They stay in the Caribbean. So although this European demand drove the trade, Africans were not passive victims. African elites and merchants controlled much of the trade with Africa, exchanging enslaved people for goods and often purchased with that American silver. However, the consequences for Africa were enormous. A lot of population loss, political instability, economic stagnation in Africa. Yet people, resisted constantly through slowdowns, escapes, rebellion, and the creation of maroon communities. Resistance reminds us that enslaved people were never simply victims, they were the historical actors. So by 1750, what we see is global trade had permanently reshaped the world. It had created massive wealth, it linked continents, and it expanded empires. But kind of the bad side of it, it also destroyed environments, exploited labor, and turned human beings into commodities. So global trade is never neutral. It always raises questions about power, inequality, and responsibility. So as you move on to the quiz and assignments, focus less on really memorizing the details and dates. Focus more on the connections like silver to China, trade to empire, commerce to human costs. And that's really the story of early modern globalization. And it's one that we're even still living with today. I have the assignment links here for you at the bottom. So make sure you do the lecture quiz before moving on to the Achieve assignments for Chapter 14.